The Hollow Creek Diner had been loud all morning. Coffee poured non-stop. Plates clattered across tables. Truck drivers argued about football scores while locals rushed through another cold Wyoming morning. Nobody paid much attention to the elderly woman quietly clearing empty cups near the counter. To most people, she was just another aging employee trying to get through her shift. Then the door opened. A former Navy SEAL stepped inside on crutches with an old German Shepherd at his side. He looked around the crowded diner searching for a place to sit. One table after another turned him away with polite smiles and reasonable excuses. The veteran never complained. He simply thanked them and moved on. Until the elderly woman pulled out a chair beside the counter and offered him a seat. It was the first kindness he received that morning. But the strangest moment came from the dog. The German Shepherd froze, its eyes locked on the woman. Then it stood and refused to look away. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. We'd love to see how far this story travels. And if stories about quiet heroes, second chances, and unexpected acts of kindness mean something to you, take a moment to subscribe. Because neither the veteran, nor the dog, nor anyone else inside that diner realized they were looking at a woman whose single decision nearly 30 years earlier had changed far more lives than she would ever know. November arrived quietly in Cedar Crossing, Wyoming. The cottonwoods along the edge of town had already given up most of their leaves, and thin ribbons of frost clung to fence posts until well after sunrise. A steady wind moved through the streets each morning, carrying the smell of wood smoke, diesel fuel, and winter coming down from the mountains. Above Harper's Pharmacy on Main Street, a single lamp glowed before dawn. Alara Voss was already awake. At 76, she moved more slowly than she once had. Her knees complained when she climbed stairs. Her hands stiffened on cold mornings. Still, she followed the same routine she had followed for years. She made a cup of tea in the small apartment where she lived alone, watered the plant beside her kitchen window, and buttoned her old wool coat before heading downstairs into the darkness. Some habits stayed longer than youth. The streets were nearly empty when she crossed town toward Hollow Creek Diner. The neon sign buzzed softly against the gray sky. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee and pie crust filled the air while the first customers settled into their usual booths. Alara unlocked the back door. The work began. She mixed pie filling. She wiped counters. She stacked clean mugs and folded napkins into neat rows. By 6:30, the diner was awake. 7, it was full. Nobody paid much attention to her. A rancher asked for more coffee without looking up from his newspaper. A construction worker slid an empty plate toward the edge of the table and expected it to disappear. 2 regulars argued over football standings while Alara quietly refilled their cups for the 3rd time that morning. Most people knew her face. Very few knew her name. That never seemed to bother her, at least not from the outside. The breakfast rush arrived with the sound of boots, truck doors, and cold air rushing through the entrance. Conversations overlapped. Silverware clinked against plates. The old jukebox near the corner booth played a country song from 20 years ago. Life moved fast around her. Near the counter, a familiar truck driver named Dale Morgan sat with another driver he often traveled with. They had been stopping at Hollow Creek Diner for years. Alara carried over 2 slices of apple pie and set them gently on the counter. "Appreciate it," the second driver said. Dale glanced at the pie. Then he glanced at Alara. A grin tugged at one side of his mouth. At her age, they ought to let her retire. His friend chuckled, or at least keep her out of the kitchen. The 2 men laughed softly and returned to their coffee. Alara heard every word. The pie server in her hand paused for a fraction of a second before she placed it back on the tray. Then she continued working. No reaction, no comment, just another table to clean. The moment passed as quickly as it arrived, swallowed by the noise of the diner and forgotten by everyone except the woman who had heard it. Outside, clouds gathered over the highway. A few miles west of town, a dark pickup rolled through a stretch of open Wyoming country. The fields on either side of the road had already turned pale gold. Wind rattled against the vehicle while loose snow from the distant hills drifted across the asphalt. Behind the wheel sat Calder Rook, 41 years old, former Navy SEAL. His dark hair carried a few strands of gray around the temples. Years of deployments had left lines around his eyes that had nothing to do with age. A folded pair of crutches rested in the back seat beside a duffel bag. Brim occupied the passenger side. The 9-year-old German shepherd watched the road with calm attention, occasionally lifting his nose toward the window whenever another vehicle passed. The dog had been with Calder through some of the hardest years of his life. That kind of loyalty changed a man. A weather alert crackled through the truck radio. Strong winds were expected through the afternoon. Snow might arrive earlier than forecast. Calder glanced toward the darkening sky. He still had several hours before reaching Montana, where a memorial service for an old teammate would be held the following day. Under normal conditions, he would have continued driving. The weather made the decision for him. A highway sign appeared ahead. Cedar Crossing, next exit, Calder signaled. The truck left the interstate and rolled into town. Neither he nor Brim knew anything about Cedar Crossing. It was simply a place to stop for a meal and wait out the worsening weather. A few hours, maybe a night, nothing more. The town looked like hundreds of other small Wyoming communities scattered across the plains. A gas station, a hardware store, a church. A diner, ordinary, very ordinary. Brim lifted his head as they passed Main Street. His ears shifted forward. The dog stared toward Hollow Creek Diner for a moment before settling back into his seat. Calder didn't notice. A gust of wind swept across town, rattling the diner windows while customers reached for their coffee cups. Inside, Elara wiped down another table near the front entrance. Her reflection appeared faintly in the glass for a brief moment before disappearing beneath the movement of passing cars. For nearly 30 years, she had carried a memory she never spoke about. A memory buried so deeply that most days she could almost convince herself it belonged to someone else. Almost outside, the dark pickup eased into a parking space. The engine shut off. Brim climbed down first. Then Calder reached for his crutches. The diner door stood only a few yards away, and for the first time in nearly 3 decades, 2 lives moving in completely different directions were about to cross. The wind pushed another wave of cold air through Main Street as Calder Rook stepped out of his truck and looked toward the glowing windows of Hollow Creek Diner. The sky had darkened since he left the interstate, and the first hints of snow drifted through the air like scattered grains of salt. Brim jumped down from the passenger side and waited patiently, while Calder reached for his crutches and locked the truck behind him. For a moment, neither man nor dog moved. Then they headed toward the diner. The bell above the entrance rang softly when the door opened. Warm air rolled over Calder's face, carrying the smell of coffee, bacon, cinnamon, and pie crust. The room remained busy, but several conversations slowed as people noticed the crutches, then the German shepherd walking beside him. It wasn't hostility. It was something quieter. Calder had seen it before. He spotted an open chair at a booth occupied by 2 middle-aged men finishing breakfast. One was folding a newspaper while the other stirred the last of his coffee. Both looked up when he approached. "Morning, gentlemen. Mind if I join you?" The 2 men exchanged a glance. The man with the newspaper offered a polite smile. "Sorry, we're expecting someone." Calder nodded. "No problem." He moved on. A few tables away, a woman in her 40s sat alone with a half-finished plate of pancakes and an untouched cup of coffee. The seat across from her remained empty. "Would you mind if I sat here?" Calder asked. The woman looked at him first, then at Brim. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I just don't feel comfortable eating around large dogs." Her tone wasn't rude. If anything, she sounded embarrassed. Calder gave her a small smile. "I understand." He moved on again. Near the windows, an older couple sat across from each other beneath a row of faded football pennants hanging from the wall. One side of the booth remained open. Before Calder could finish his question, the woman spoke first. "We were hoping for a quiet breakfast." Her husband looked down at his coffee. The answer was gentle. The message was clear. Calder thanked them and continued walking. Around him, plates continued to clatter and coffee continued to pour. Nobody stared for long, nobody raised their voice. Yet with every step, the distance between him and everyone else seemed to grow a little wider. Years earlier, that kind of thing might have bothered him. Today, it mostly made him tired. Then he heard a chair slide across the floor. "There's room here." The voice came from the counter. Alara Voss had pulled out the empty stool beside her workstation and was holding it with one hand. Calder paused. The offer was so simple that it took him a second to answer. "I'd appreciate that." He settled onto the stool while Brim lay down beside him. Alara filled a mug with fresh coffee and placed it in front of him before returning to her work. She didn't ask about his leg. She didn't ask about the dog. She didn't thank him for his service or tell him her cousin had once served in the military. She simply treated him like a customer. The coffee was hot. That mattered more than most people realize. Outside, the wind rattled the diner windows while traffic moved slowly through town. Inside, the breakfast rush continued. Orders came and went from the kitchen. Customers paid their checks and left. Others arrived to take their place. Calder found himself watching Alara as she moved through the room. There was nothing dramatic about her. She carried coffee pots, cleared dishes, wiped tables, and carried pie slices from the kitchen to the counter. Yet she seemed to notice everything around her. A customer reaching for more napkins would find them already on the table. An empty coffee cup rarely stayed empty for long. When a mother struggled with a restless toddler, Alara quietly appeared with crayons and a coloring page without being asked. Years of experience showed in the details. Brim watched her too. The German shepherd rarely paid attention to strangers for very long. Usually he settled down once he understood there was no threat. This time was different. His eyes followed Alara whenever she crossed the room, and every so often his ears lifted as though he were trying to understand something. Calder noticed. So did the dog. Near the center of the diner sat Walter Jensen, a retired mechanic who spent most mornings reading agricultural reports while eating breakfast alone. He had nearly finished his meal when something changed. The fork slipped from his hand. His chair shifted backward. A harsh cough echoed through the room. Several heads turned. Walter's face reddened almost immediately as he grabbed at his throat and tried unsuccessfully to draw a full breath. The conversations around him faded into uncertainty. People looked at one another, waiting for someone else to move first. Alara was already crossing the room. The speed surprised Calder. Not because she moved fast for her age, but because she moved with purpose. Her attention narrowed instantly onto Walter. The confusion that had filled the room never seemed to reach her. She knelt beside him and assessed the situation in seconds. "Call 911, Calder said as he pulled out his phone. Someone nearby moved chairs out of the way. Another customer stepped aside to create space. Walter continued struggling for air while Alara worked calmly beside him, speaking in a steady voice that remained low enough for only him to hear. Nothing about her movements felt improvised. Everything looked practiced. Within moments, the blockage cleared. Walter bent forward, coughing hard while drawing deep breaths that sounded louder than anything else in the diner. Relief spread across the room like a wave. Several customers exhaled. One woman pressed a hand against her chest. Another quietly whispered a prayer of thanks. Alara stayed beside Walter until his breathing steadied. Only then did she stand. "You all right?" she asked. Walter nodded and wiped his eyes. "Thanks, Alara." She offered a small smile and returned to work, just like that. As though saving someone from choking was no more remarkable than refilling a coffee cup. The diner slowly returned to normal. Conversations resumed. Plates arrived from the kitchen. The storm outside continued creeping closer to town, but something had changed. Calder stared into his coffee for several seconds before looking up again. The woman serving pie and wiping tables no longer looked quite as ordinary as she had an hour earlier. There was a confidence in her movements that didn't belong to someone who had spent her entire life inside a diner. There was discipline hidden beneath the routine, training hidden beneath the years. Across the room, Brim remained focused on her. The dog had not looked away once. And for the first time that morning, Calder found himself wondering who Alara Voss had been before Cedar Crossing ever learned her name. The storm arrived faster than expected. By early afternoon, snowflakes drifted steadily across Main Street, softening the outlines of parked trucks and storefront signs. The traffic outside Hollow Creek Diner slowed to a crawl, while customers lingered longer than usual over their coffee, watching winter settle over Cedar Crossing 1 hour at a time. Inside, the diner felt smaller than it had that morning. Warmer, too. Calder remained at the counter while Brim rested beside him. He had already finished 2 cups of coffee, yet neither he nor the dog seemed eager to leave. The weather provided a practical excuse. The woman moving quietly through the diner provided another. Alara Voss continued working, as though nothing unusual had happened. Walter Jensen had recovered enough to joke about nearly choking on a piece of sausage. The customers who had witnessed the incident gradually returned to their conversations. By now, most people treated it as one of those small-town stories that would be mentioned for a few days and then quietly disappear. Calder wasn't ready to let it disappear. The more he watched Alara, the less she fit the picture people seemed to have of her. She noticed things before other people did. When a delivery driver entered carrying 2 heavy boxes, she moved a chair out of his path before he reached it. When a customer searching for reading glasses began patting his jacket pockets, she pointed toward the counter where he had left them 10 minutes earlier. Even during quiet moments, her eyes occasionally drifted toward the entrance, then toward the emergency exit near the kitchen, before returning to whatever task was in front of her. The habit seemed unconscious, like breathing. Years ago, Calder had seen similar behavior in people whose jobs required them to stay alert long after everyone else relaxed. He watched for another 20 minutes. Then he finally asked, "Were you a nurse?" Alara looked up from a stack of clean plates. No. The answer came quickly. Too quickly, Calder noticed. "So you've had some medical training." A faint smile appeared on her face. Everybody learns a few things if they live long enough. She returned to stacking plates. The conversation ended there. Or at least she intended it to. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windows. A football game played silently on the television above the counter while customers followed the score beneath the scrolling headlines. Somewhere near the kitchen, a dishwasher hummed steadily beneath the noise of conversation. Life settled back into its rhythm, yet Brim never stopped watching. The German shepherd lay quietly on the floor, with his head resting on his paws, but his eyes followed Alara whenever she crossed the room. Every movement seemed to interest him. Every glance, every gesture. At one point, Alara walked past carrying a tray of coffee mugs. Brim immediately lifted his head. His ears shifted forward. The dog remained that way until she disappeared into the kitchen. Calder frowned. "You're acting like she's wearing a uniform." Brim's tail thumped once against the floor. Nothing more. An hour later, the lunch crowd began replacing the breakfast crowd. Several tables emptied while others filled again. Alara moved between them with the same steady pace she had maintained all morning. Then something caught Calder's attention. She was reaching for a coffee pot on the highest shelf behind the counter when the sleeve of her coat slipped back slightly. A worn Timex watch appeared on her wrist. The leather strap had clearly been repaired more than once, and attached near the clasp was a small metal tag no larger than a thumbnail. The tag swung briefly as she reached upward. Calder saw only part of it. Most of the engraving had been worn away by time. 2 characters remained visible, H7. The sight struck him with the strange force of a half-forgotten memory. He didn't react immediately. Instead, he watched Alara lower the coffee pot and continue working as though nothing had happened. His mind traveled elsewhere. Years earlier, during training exercises and deployment briefings, older service members occasionally shared stories that never appeared in official reports. Some stories were exaggerated. Some were probably invented. Others carried the weight of truth. One name surfaced from those memories. Harbor 7. Not a commander, not a decorated hero who appeared on magazine covers, a combat medic, a woman. Someone who had served during Black Canyon mission in 1997. Calder remembered hearing about impossible evacuation conditions, severe casualties, and a medic who had worked for hours treating wounded soldiers under circumstances few people envied. The details had faded over time. The nickname hadn't. Across the room, Brim suddenly stood. The dog wasn't barking. He wasn't growling. He simply rose to his feet and stared toward Alara with a level of focus that made several nearby customers glance in the same direction. Alara paused, only for a second. Then she continued pouring coffee. Calder felt a quiet tension settle between memory and possibility. The idea seemed absurd. Harbor 7 belonged to another era, another life, another generation. The woman wiping tables in front of him couldn't possibly be the same person. Could she? The question stayed with him for nearly half an hour. Finally, as the afternoon crowd thinned and snow continued falling beyond the windows, Calder spoke again. "Can I ask you something?" Alara carried a tray of clean mugs toward the counter. "You just did." Calder smiled, the first genuine smile he had managed all day. He waited until she set the mugs down, then he said it. "Harbor 7. The room around them continued moving. Coffee poured, plates clattered. A television commentator celebrated a touchdown somewhere above their heads. Yet for a brief moment, Calder had the strange feeling that everything had gone still. Alara's hands stopped moving. The dish towel she had been folding remained suspended between her fingers. She didn't look at Calder immediately. Instead, she stared at the countertop in front of her as though seeing something far away. Seconds passed, then more. Brim remained standing, watching. When Alara finally raised her eyes, the faint smile she usually carried had disappeared. She looked older than she had that morning. Not weaker, just farther away. For a long time, she said nothing at all. Calder wondered whether he had made a mistake. Then Alara folded the towel carefully and placed it beside the register. "I haven't heard that name in nearly 30 years. And for the first time since entering Hollow Creek Diner, Calder knew with absolute certainty that the woman everyone overlooked was carrying a history far larger than anyone in Cedar Crossing could imagine. For several seconds after Alara spoke, neither she nor Calder said another word. The late afternoon crowd had thinned, leaving only a handful of customers scattered throughout the diner. Snow continued drifting past the windows, covering parked cars and quiet sidewalks with a thin white layer. The television above the counter kept talking to itself while coffee steamed from half-finished mugs. Life carried on, yet something had shifted. Alara picked up the dish towel she had folded moments earlier and turned toward the coffee station. Her movements remained steady, but Calder noticed the change immediately. The distance in her eyes had returned. Not the distance of age or exhaustion, but the distance of someone standing in two different decades at the same time. He waited. Eventually she spoke. "I was 28. Calder looked up. Alara stared out the front window while snowflakes drifted beneath the diner lights. "I thought I was prepared for everything." A faint smile touched her face. Most young medics think that. The smile disappeared. Outside, a pickup truck rolled slowly down Main Street with its headlights cutting through the snowfall. Inside the diner, the coffee machine hissed softly in the background. Alara continued. The winter of 1997 had been colder than expected in eastern Afghanistan. Black Canyon Mission had already gone wrong before her medical unit received the first casualty reports. A convoy moving through a narrow canyon had been hit during an ambush, and evacuation helicopters struggled to reach the wounded because of weather and terrain. The injured arrived in waves. Then they arrived all at once. By the middle of the night, the medical tent had become a blur of blood, mud, exhaustion, and impossible decisions. Every stretcher seemed to carry someone who needed immediate attention. Every voice sounded urgent. Every minute mattered. Harbor 7. That had been her call sign, a name she hadn't heard in decades. The words hung quietly between them. Calder listened, so did Brim. At 4:17 that morning, two soldiers were brought into the treatment area within moments of each other. Both had suffered catastrophic injuries. Both needed immediate intervention. Both might die without it. There weren't enough hands. There wasn't enough time. There was only a choice. Alara closed her eyes briefly. Even after all these years, she still remembered their faces. One of the soldiers was Garrick Hale. The other was Thomas Mercer. Neither man was much older than she was. Both had families waiting at home. Both believed they would survive the night. The memory seemed to settle heavily over the counter between them. "I chose Garrick," the sentence came quietly. No drama, no attempt to justify it, only truth. The other medic stayed with Thomas. Her fingers tightened around the coffee pot handle. "Garrick made it through surgery." She paused. Thomas didn't. The snowfall outside thickened. A snowplow crawled down the street, leaving two clean tracks through the accumulating white. For a while, Calder said nothing. Alara wasn't looking for reassurance. He could tell. Some wounds survived because people fed them for years. This one had lived nearly 3 decades. She glanced down at the old Timex watch resting on her wrist. The crystal was scratched. The leather strap had been repaired more than once. Time had worn away almost everything except the essentials. It stopped that morning. Calder followed her gaze. 4:17, Alara nodded. The battery died years later. Her fingers rested lightly against the watch. I never replaced it. The answer explained more than she intended. Across the diner, Walter Jensen paid his bill and headed for the door. Before leaving, he offered Alara a grateful nod. She smiled politely in return, then watched him disappear into the falling snow. Another life still moving forward. Another life still here. Calder looked toward Brim. The German shepherd remained unusually quiet. His head rested near Calder's knee, but his eyes never left Alara. Finally, Calder pushed himself upright. I'll be right back. Alara frowned slightly. Where are you going? My truck. He disappeared through the front door and into the cold. Snowflakes swirled around him as he crossed the parking lot. The wind had strengthened since morning, and fresh snow already covered parts of the windshield. He opened the back seat, reached into a weathered duffel bag, and pulled out a large envelope that had traveled with him for years. Several minutes later, he returned. The envelope landed gently on the counter. Alara looked at it, then at him. What is this? Calder opened it carefully. Inside were photographs, old photographs, some worn at the edges, some newer, all preserved. He slid the first one across the counter. A younger Garrick Hale smiled back from the image. His uniform was dusty. His face looked tired. One arm rested across the shoulders of another soldier standing beside him. Alive. Alara stared at the photograph without speaking. Calder placed another beside it, then another. The years unfolded one image at a time. Garrick standing beside a woman in a wedding photo. Garrick holding a newborn daughter. Garrick at a backyard barbecue with 2 young sons. Garrick laughing beneath a fishing hat beside a lake. Garrick surrounded by grandchildren. Life. Ordinary life. The kind of life people rarely think about while making decisions inside a medical tent during a war. Alara reached toward one photograph but stopped before touching it. Her hand remained suspended for a moment. Then she picked it up. The image showed Garrick sitting in a folding chair with a little girl asleep against his shoulder. The photograph trembled slightly, only slightly. Calder let the silence do its work. Eventually, he pointed toward another picture near the bottom of the stack. This one showed 3 men and a German shepherd standing near a military vehicle. Garrick occupied the center. Calder stood beside him. A younger Brim sat in front of them. I met him years later. Alara looked up. Calder nodded. There was an explosion during a mission. The memory softened his voice. I was trapped under debris. Snow tapped quietly against the window. Garrick came back. The sentence hung there, simple, heavy. He got me out. Alara lowered her eyes to the photograph. If he hadn't. Calder glanced at Brim. I wouldn't be sitting here today. Brim lifted his head, and neither would he. For a long time, nobody spoke. The diner seemed quieter than before. Even the television noise felt distant. Outside, evening settled over Cedar Crossing while snow covered the streets in a blanket of white. Alara continued looking at the photographs. At the wife Garrick had loved. At the children he had raised. At the grandchildren who would never know her name. For nearly 30 years, she had carried one version of that story. Now she was seeing another. And for the first time since Black Canyon Mission, Alara Voss began to understand that the decision she had mourned as the greatest mistake of her life had reached farther than she had ever imagined. Snow covered Cedar Crossing overnight. The storm that had spent the previous day circling the town finally settled in, leaving a thin white blanket across rooftops, sidewalks, and parked trucks. Main Street looked quieter than usual beneath the pale morning light. Tire tracks cut through the fresh snow, and chimney smoke rose slowly into the cold Wyoming air. By 6 o'clock, the neon sign of Hollow Creek Diner was glowing once again. So was the light above Harper's Pharmacy. Alara Voss followed the same routine she always had. She climbed down the stairs from her apartment, crossed the street with her hands tucked into her coat pockets, and unlocked the diner before most of the town had finished breakfast at home. The coffee machine hummed to life. Pie crusts waited on cooling racks. Clean mugs stood upside down beside the counter. Everything looked exactly the same, yet somehow it didn't. The previous evening lingered with her long after Calder and Brim had left. The photographs remained on her kitchen table. Before going to bed, she had looked through them one more time. Then again after waking up. A wedding, a family picnic, a fishing trip, a little girl asleep on Garrick Hale's shoulder. Ordinary moments, the kind that never make history books. The kind that make a life. By 7 o'clock, the first customers began arriving. Walter Jensen came through the door carrying a wool cap dusted with snow. He spotted Alara near the coffee station and walked directly toward her. "Morning, Alara." The words were simple. Still, they felt different. Walter hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I never thanked you properly yesterday." Alara smiled. "You don't owe me anything, Walter. I think I do." The retired mechanic touched the brim of his cap and headed toward his usual booth. Nothing dramatic followed, just gratitude. A few minutes later, Dale Morgan entered with his usual group of truck drivers. The same man who had joked about her age the previous morning stopped at the counter and placed his empty mug beside the coffee pot. "Morning, Miss Voss." The title surprised her more than the greeting. Dale cleared his throat. "Roads are slick this morning. They usually are after the first snowfall. Suppose they are." Neither mentioned the joke he had made the day before. Neither needed to. The conversation moved on. Several regular customers greeted her by name throughout the morning. A rancher asked about her apple pie recipe. A young mother introduced her toddler before sitting down for breakfast. Even the owner of the diner seemed to linger longer than usual when speaking with her. Nobody knew the full story. Most never would. Yet something had changed. People had started paying attention. Shortly before noon, the bell above the diner door rang again. Calder stepped inside. Brim followed close beside him. The snowfall had eased, though gray clouds still hung low over the hills surrounding town. Calder carried no photographs this time. Instead, he wore the same quiet expression he had carried throughout most of the previous day. "You got a few minutes?" he asked. Alara studied him. "For what? I'd rather show you." An hour later, Calder's truck climbed a narrow road leading out of Cedar Crossing. Snow covered the fields on either side, interrupted only by fences and clusters of leafless cottonwoods. Brim sat in the back seat, watching the landscape pass by through the frosted window. Neither Calder nor Alara spoke much. The destination didn't require conversation. The cemetery rested on a hillside overlooking the valley. Small American flags stood beside several military headstones, their fabric fluttering in the cold wind. Fresh snow covered parts of the ground, leaving only the tops of some markers visible. Brim walked beside them as they followed a narrow path between the rows. The dog moved more slowly here, almost respectfully. Eventually, Calder stopped. Alara followed his gaze. The name carved into the stone was one she had carried for nearly 30 years. Thomas Merker. The winter wind moved softly through the cemetery. Alara stood still. She remembered the medical tent, the generators, the smell of fuel and antiseptic, the impossible choice. Time collapsed inward for a moment. Then Calder reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a weathered envelope. "You should read this." The paper inside had been copied many years earlier. The edges were worn from being handled, though someone had clearly taken care to preserve it. Alara unfolded the letter. Thomas Mercer had written it before Black Canyon Mission. The handwriting was steady, confident, human. She read slowly. The words spoke about home, about family, about returning when the deployment ended. There were small jokes scattered throughout the letter and references to ordinary things that mattered to ordinary people. A fence that needed repairing, a fishing trip he planned to take, a promise to call as soon as he returned. The final lines waited near the bottom of the page. Alara read them twice, then a third time. "If anything happens, don't let anyone carry the blame. Everyone out here is doing the best they can." The cemetery grew quiet around her. Even the wind seemed distant. For years she had imagined what she would say if given the chance to apologize to Thomas Mercer. Entire conversations had played through her mind during sleepless nights. Words she should have spoken. Explanations she should have offered. Standing there now, she realized something she had never allowed herself to consider. The only person still carrying the weight of that decision was her. Her hand trembled slightly as she folded the letter. Not much, just enough. Neither Calder nor Brim interrupted the silence. Some things deserved room to breathe. On the drive back to town, the truck remained quiet. Snow-covered fields rolled past outside the windows while afternoon sunlight pushed through gaps in the clouds. Halfway back to Cedar Crossing, Calder handed her a small wooden box. Alara looked at him. "What's this? Open it." Inside rested her old military watch, the Timex. The scratched crystal remained the same. The worn leather strap remained the same. Even the small metal tag engraved with H7 remained attached near the clasp. One thing had changed. The hands were moving. Tick, tick, tick. For a moment, Alara simply stared. The sound was almost too small to hear. Almost. "I had a friend look at it this morning," Calder said. Turns out it still had a few years left in it. Alara closed her fingers around the watch. Neither of them spoke again for several miles. Back at Hollow Creek Diner, the afternoon crowd had begun filtering through the doors. Calder gathered his things. The roads had improved enough for him to continue toward Montana before nightfall. Brim stood beside him near the entrance. As they prepared to leave, the woman who had refused to share her table the previous morning approached slowly. She hesitated for a second before crouching beside the German shepherd. "Take care, old boy." Her hand rested briefly on Brim's neck. The dog leaned into the touch. Nothing more. A few moments later, Calder reached the front door. Before he could pull it open, one of the men who had claimed to be waiting for a friend stepped forward and held it for him. Their eyes met briefly. No apology followed. None was necessary. Calder nodded. The man nodded back. The gesture lasted less than 2 seconds, yet both understood it. Outside, the truck engine started. Brim climbed into the passenger seat. Then they were gone. That evening, Alara sat beside the window of her apartment overlooking Main Street. Snow drifted beneath the streetlights, while the town settled into another quiet Wyoming night. The photographs of Garrick Hale rested on the table beside her chair. The letter from Thomas Mercer lay folded neatly beside them. On her wrist, the old watch continued ticking. The sound filled the room, not loudly, just enough. The years she had lost would never return. The people she had mourned would never walk through her door. War had taken what war always takes. But for the first time in nearly 3 decades, time was no longer frozen at 4:17. And for the first time in nearly 3 decades, Alara Voss allowed herself to believe that it might finally be time to set the burden down. You know, the older I get, the more I notice how much of life happens in small, forgettable places. A diner before sunrise, a cup of coffee growing cold, a familiar face behind a counter. Most days, we walk past people without knowing what they've carried, what they've survived, or what memories still follow them home at night. That's what stayed with me here. Not the mission, not the medals, not even the secret Alara kept for all those years. It was the fact that she kept showing up. Day after day, year after year, while carrying a question she never found an answer to. I think a lot of us understand that feeling. Maybe it's a decision we still replay. Maybe it's a loss we've never completely made peace with. Maybe it's simply wondering if something we did long ago mattered more than we realized. And sometimes, in ways we never expect, life gives us a chance to see the story differently. Maybe that's grace. Maybe that's one of those quiet ways God reminds us that we're not meant to carry everything forever. If this story brought a memory to mind, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about ordinary people, loyal dogs, and second chances, please consider liking and subscribing. This story is fictional, but the feelings behind it are borrowed from real life. Somewhere tonight, an old clock is ticking beside someone's bed, and a burden feels just a little lighter than it did yesterday.